When we hear the words wonders of the ancient world, memory obligingly produces the familiar set: the Egyptian pyramids, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, the Colossus of Rhodes, the Lighthouse of Alexandria. 7 monuments turned by textbooks into a definitive catalogue of human greatness. But the ancient world did not end at the shores of the Mediterranean, and it certainly did not build according to a pre-approved ranking. Imagine a staircase that does not rise toward a temple, but descends deep underground to halls cut into stone thousands of years ago. Or a tunnel driven through a mountain in an age without laser levels or satellite surveying. 2 teams advanced toward one another through solid rock, and an error of only a few degrees could have ruined the entire undertaking. Now move to the desert coast of Peru. 13 towers stand along the ridge of a hill. At first, they look like a strange line of fortifications, but from a particular observation point, with the rising sun behind them, the towers become a colossal calendar stretched across the horizon. Elsewhere, water passes through dams, canals, tunnels, and stone spillways, making an entire city work. This is no longer a single monument. It is a complex engineering system in which terrain, river current, and human calculation are joined into one mechanism. And there are dozens of ancient pyramids far to the south of Egypt. They stand in groups amid the sand, yet rarely appear in popular accounts of the past. All these structures are real. Archaeologists, engineers, and historians study them. Some survive well enough for us to understand how they worked. Others have reached us only in fragments, forcing us to distinguish what has been demonstrated from what is merely probable. That raises the central question. If these structures are truly so extraordinary, why do we hear so little about them? The answer begins with an uncomfortable but important fact. The famous 7 wonders were never an objective ranking of humanity's finest structures. No one surveyed the entire known world, compared construction technologies, and tried to decide where the engineering challenge had been greatest. The lists were compiled by ancient writers from a particular cultural environment. They wrote mainly about what lay within the Greek and later Roman horizon. Nor was there originally one immutable list. Different authors named different marvels. Over time, several versions fused into the canon repeated today by books, films, and school curricula. The word wonder itself also needs explanation. For an ancient traveler, it did not necessarily mean the greatest achievement by every possible measure. It meant a sight worthy of astonishment, something unusually tall, immense, richly ornamented, or associated with a celebrated city. In effect, the list was an ancient guidebook to places an educated traveler might wish to see in person. That method of selection excluded enormous regions from the outset. A structure could be technically remarkable, but if few outsiders visited it, if nobody described it in a widely read language, and if later copyists did not preserve the account, it gradually disappeared from the shared picture of the past. There is also a more material reason. Stone preserves memory better than timber. Fired brick survives better than mud brick. A tomb cut into rock has a better chance of crossing the centuries than a sophisticated network of earth dams, wooden roofs, and canals that must be cleaned continuously. Hydraulic networks are especially vulnerable to oblivion. While they operate, they form a single mechanism. Stop maintaining them, and the canals fill with silt, reservoirs collapse, and streams change course. A few generations later, all that remains of an engineering system may be scattered depressions and walls whose purpose is no longer obvious. This produces an error we still make. We unconsciously mistake survival for complexity and familiarity for historical importance. A monument shown again and again appears great. A structure preserved only in fragments or located far from popular routes begins to seem as though it never existed at all. Archaeology works differently. It evaluates more than the height of columns or the beauty of a facade. Layout, methods of working material, organization of labor, relationship to the landscape, evidence of repair, and the ability to perform a function all matter. Sometimes a few inconspicuous channels reveal more about a society's engineering than a colossal statue. So this story is not a competition between monuments. We are not going to choose an eighth wonder or award places in a league table. The more interesting question is what problem the ancient builders were solving, why they chose a particular design, and what genuinely remains of their intention. We should begin with a place that is almost impossible to appreciate from outside. There is no enormous dome, high tower, or row of columns above it. Its essential architecture is hidden underground. From the surface, the Khal Saflieni hypogeum hardly looks like an ancient wonder. There is no silhouette visible from kilometers away, no colonnade, tower, or monumental gate. Ordinary streets in the Maltese town of Paola conceal a structure created before the Egyptian pyramids. To grasp its scale, you do not look up, you descend. The word hypogeum literally means an underground structure. Yet, Khal Saflieni is not a single cave or a random collection of excavations. It is a complex system of chambers, passages, niches, and stairways arranged on 3 levels. The complex developed gradually over many centuries. Its upper section came first. Later, builders cut ever deeper, until the lowest rooms lay more than 10 meters below the modern surface. Let us follow the route in our imagination. A visitor first entered the upper part of the complex, where natural hollows in the soft limestone had been enlarged and connected. Daylight could still reach this area through the entrance. Farther inside, the character of the space changed. Passages narrowed, rooms became darker, and movement depended increasingly on a route deliberately imposed by the builders. On the middle level are the most expressive chambers, with walls and ceilings worked to resemble architecture above ground. This is where Khal Saflieni ceases to be merely an underground refuge or a rock-cut tomb. The craftsmen reproduced features of Malta's megalithic temples: openings, lintels, false windows, and roof forms. They carved the image of a built structure into a single mass of stone. A rock ceiling could imitate a ceiling assembled from separate blocks, although the imitation served no structural need. That detail is crucial. The builders were not merely hollowing out useful space, they were making a recognizable architectural environment. The underground chambers were meant to be perceived in a particular way. Those who entered did not see a natural cave, but a human-made world with its own sequence of rooms, and, most likely, its own rules of access. The tools were remarkably simple: stone implements, flint blades, obsidian, and animal horn. The soft Globigerina limestone could be cut, but that did not make the task easy. A vast quantity of rock had to be removed. Chambers had to retain the intended shape, while the workers needed to judge where they could cut farther without destroying the levels already completed. Red ochre paintings survive on walls and ceilings. Spirals and geometric designs show that the interior was not left as a rough excavation. It was finished and decorated. In the weak light of oil lamps, the red lines must have appeared very differently from the way they do under modern museum lighting. They would have emerged gradually from darkness, together with the curves of the walls and the shadows cast by irregular stone. Darkness itself was an architectural instrument. Almost no natural light reached the lower levels. A person could see only a small area ahead, while footsteps and voices returned from the stone. The whole room could not be understood at a glance, and the direction of the next passage was not always apparent. Monumentality here was created not by a facade, but by control over perception. The so-called oracle room has inspired particular debate. A voice spoken into one of its niches acquires a noticeable resonance that carries into neighboring chambers. The effect exists and can be measured acoustically. Interpretation begins after that. We do not know whether the niche was designed as an acoustic device, whether it was used in ceremonies, or whether its unusual sound was simply a consequence of the chamber's shape. This is where a responsible account must stop short of replacing archaeology with a good story. No recording of a ritual survives, and no text explains the room's purpose. We cannot claim that priests certainly spoke from it with the voices of the gods. It is reasonable to suggest that people noticed the resonance and may have used it. The difference between those two statements is the line between evidence-based reconstruction and fantasy. The function of the entire complex also changed over time. Hal Saflieni served as a place of collective burial. Archaeologists found the remains of several thousand people, together with pottery, ornaments, amulets, and small figurines. The arrangement of the bones suggests that burial may have involved several stages. Bodies were not always placed in their final location immediately, and the remains of different people were later gathered together. Yet, cemetery is not an adequate description. The investment of labor, the architectural imitations, painted ceilings, and careful arrangement of interior spaces point to a place of profound communal and symbolic importance. Whether it began as a sanctuary and later became a necropolis, or whether burial formed part of its purpose from an early stage, remains unsettled. Hal Saflieni overturns our usual idea of ancient grandeur. Its creators did not try to make the structure visible from far away. They did the opposite. They separated an inner world from the outer one, immersed visitors in darkness, and led them through spaces in which light, sound, and direction mattered as much as stone. The wonder was not height, it was depth. The next step is even more unexpected. Ancient builders learned to organize not only the movement of people within a monument, but the movement of water across an entire city. After leaving the subterranean darkness of Hal Saflieni, we remain in the world of hidden engineering. The difference is that the mechanism before us is now not one building, it is a whole city. Dholavira stood on Kadir Island in the salt flats of the Great Rann of Kutch in western India. Today the landscape can look almost lifeless, pale saline ground, dry air, sparse vegetation. Yet from the 3rd millennium BCE, one of the major centers of the Harappan civilization flourished here. The location seems inconvenient. Rainfall is limited, there is no permanent full-flowing river nearby, and 2 local streams filled mainly during the monsoon. Water arrived unevenly. In some years or seasons there was enough, in others almost none. The builders therefore had to do more than locate a source. They had to intercept water during the brief favorable period, direct it into the city, store it, and continue using it long after the rains had ended. Much of Dholavira was organized around this problem. Barriers were built across natural channels, and seasonal flows were guided toward a system of reservoirs. Some basins were cut into the ground, others were reinforced with masonry. Channels and drains connected different parts of the network. Water was not stored in one immense pool, whose failure would have been catastrophic. It was distributed among several reservoirs. That decision offered several advantages. Sediment could settle before the water moved farther. Reservoirs could be cleaned or repaired one at a time. The loss of one basin did not destroy the entire reserve. And storage close to different parts of the city reduced the distance over which water had to be carried. This is systems thinking. A reservoir alone is not an extraordinary achievement, nor is a canal. Engineering begins when terrain, direction of flow, seasonal rainfall, evaporation, human demand, and regular maintenance are considered together. Archaeologists, therefore, see at Dholavira not one miraculous device, but an interconnected water infrastructure. Urban planning, fortifications, drains, and storage did not exist independently. They formed a single strategy for survival in an arid environment. We should not turn Dholavira into a modern city with a tap in every building. the daily distribution of water cannot be reconstructed in every detail. We do not know with certainty which reservoirs supplied drinking water, which served domestic work, or which may have held ceremonial significance. But the overall principle is clear. Water was part of the architecture of the city. Now travel far west, to the Karun River in ancient Iran. At Shushtar, builders faced a different challenge. Their first concern was not to preserve every rare trickle. They had a major river, and therefore had to manage its force. Water always seeks the easiest route. Engineering makes it follow the required one. At Shushtar, dams, weirs, and artificial canals redirected the flow. One of the key elements, the Gargar Canal, was effectively a human-made river channel. Water entered a network of tunnels, divided into separate streams, and was directed toward milling installations. It then fell into a lower basin and continued toward irrigated land. The same water performed several tasks in sequence. It helped supply the city, drove milling machinery, irrigated fields, and shaped the transport and defensive organization of the territory. The river was no longer merely a natural feature. It became a working component of the urban economy. The system visible today developed over many periods. Its oldest foundations are associated with the Achaemenid era, while much of the completed structure belongs to the first centuries of the Common Era. Shushtar cannot be credited to one ruler, one architect, or one construction campaign. It represents a long accumulation of hydraulic knowledge in which local and borrowed solutions were combined. Dolavira and Shushtar both reveal something easy to miss in beautiful photographs of ruins. These systems could not operate by themselves. Canals silted up, masonry failed, streams shifted course, reservoirs had to be cleared, while dams needed rebuilding after floods. Without continuous maintenance, sophisticated infrastructure quickly became a collection of useless hollows and walls. The distinction between the two cities is fundamental. Dolavira was shaped by the need to preserve water that appeared rarely. Shushtar was shaped by the effort to control water that moved continuously. In one case, the essential resource was a reserve. In the other, it was flow and energy. Yet a more important idea connects them. Ancient engineers did not try to defeat nature with a single colossal structure. They studied the behavior of water and built a chain of works, each performing one part of the task. The meaning of wonder changes again. This is not merely an object to admire, it is a system that must be understood. But ancient builders did not control only stone, terrain, and water. Sometimes the architectural mechanism included something that cannot be touched, the movement of the sun along the horizon. On the desert coast of Peru, roughly 300 kilometers north of Lima, 13 stone towers stand on a low ridge. They are not identical, yet together they form a regular serrated line against the sky. This is Chanquilo, a complex dating to approximately the 4th century BCE. From close range, each tower appears modest. The astonishing feature emerges only when the towers are viewed as a single system. From designated observation points to the east and west, they create an artificial horizon. Over the year, the position of sunrise and sunset shifts north and south. The sun appears beside a different tower or in a different gap as the seasons change. Architecture here does not merely occupy the landscape. It edits the horizon so that time becomes visible. This is why Chanquilo cannot be dismissed as a building that happens to face the sun. Many ancient structures have some astronomical orientation, and vague claims can be made about almost any arrangement if enough lines are drawn after the fact. Chanquilo is different because the entire sequence of 13 towers, together with the surviving observation points, corresponds to the annual solar arc. It could mark dates across the year, not merely a single solstice. The principle is straightforward. At the June solstice, the sun reaches one extreme of its annual movement. At the December solstice, it reaches the other. Between them, its rising or setting point advances progressively through the intervals between the towers. A trained observer could estimate the time of year by noting where the sun touched the constructed skyline. That knowledge had practical value. Agricultural communities depended on seasonal rhythms: sowing, irrigation, harvesting, and the organization of labor. A reliable calendar allowed people to coordinate activity even when weather varied. Yet the calendar was not necessarily a neutral public instrument. Access to the best observation positions appears to have been controlled by the architecture of the complex. Knowledge of time could therefore reinforce authority. The person who can announce the proper day for a ceremony or the beginning of an agricultural task does more than read the sky. He presents social order as though it were aligned with cosmic order. We should be careful not to invent the exact ceremonies or titles of those observers. The evidence does not preserve them. But the connection between specialized observation, public ritual, and political power is a reasonable interpretation of the layout. Chanquillo expands our definition of a structure. Half of the instrument is built from stone, the other half consists of sunlight, viewpoint, and horizon. Remove the observer from the correct place, and the towers become an irregular row. Put the observer back, and the mechanism starts working. Its precision should not be mythologized. The system was not a modern astronomical observatory, and cloud, atmospheric conditions, and human judgment affected what could be seen. It did not need to measure seconds. It needed to organize a year. That was enough to connect landscape, agriculture, ceremony, and authority. And it shows that ancient architecture could control not only where a person moved, but how a society located itself in time. The next wonder returns us to a harder, more physical problem. Instead of reading the horizon, engineers had to preserve a direction where no horizon could be seen at all. Inside a mountain. On the Greek island of Samos, a fortified city needed a dependable water supply. An exposed aqueduct could be observed, damaged, or cut during a siege. The solution associated with the engineer Eupalinos was audacious: bring water through Mount Castro in a tunnel more than a kilometer long. The tunnel, built in the 6th century BCE, is impressive not simply because people cut through rock with iron tools. The real problem was measurement. A crew working from only one side would face a long construction period and difficult removal of spoil. Two crews could work faster from opposite sides, but then both had to maintain direction through a mountain they could not see through. At the entrances, surface surveying could establish a common alignment. Simple instruments, sighting rods, plumb lines, chords, and measured angles were sufficient in principle. But simple does not mean easy. Every reading carried an error. A small angular deviation, repeated over hundreds of meters, could become a large lateral displacement. Height mattered as well. Water required a controlled gradient, while the working passage had to remain accessible. The builders separated some of these problems. They first created a main passage that allowed crews and spoil to move. A narrower water channel was then cut at a lower level with the necessary slope. This was not one perfect line produced in a single attempt. It was a sequence of practical decisions. The most dramatic moment is the approach of the two headings. Popular retellings often describe an almost miraculous meeting at the exact center. The actual traces are more interesting. The tunnel bends. Corrections appear in both horizontal and vertical alignment. The builders widened the effective target and adjusted their route as information accumulated. Those deviations are not evidence of failure. They are evidence of engineering. Absolute straightness would tell us less about how the work was done. The corrections show people confronting uncertainty, recognizing risk, and designing a way to survive error. One likely strategy was to make the approaching tunnels curve in opposite directions near the expected meeting zone. If both crews had continued along mathematically ideal, but slightly mistaken straight lines, they might have passed one another in parallel. By turning, they increased the chance of intersection. Changes in direction also helped deal with unstable rock and allowed the builders to respond to conditions encountered underground. Inside the mountain, the physical labor was relentless. Workers struck the rock in confined space. Oil lamps consumed oxygen and produced smoke. Broken stone had to be carried out through a narrow corridor. Ventilation, illumination, drainage, tool maintenance, and the organization of shifts were not secondary details. Without them, the geometry on the surface meant nothing. Once completed, the aqueduct still required care. Water channels accumulate mineral deposits and sediment. Sections need inspection. Access must remain possible. The enduring achievement was therefore not merely the first breakthrough, but the creation of a serviceable water route protected within the mountain. The Tunnel of Eupalinos is often recruited into stories about lost technology, as if ordinary ancient tools could not possibly have produced it. That claim underestimates the builders. No mysterious device is required. What is required is geometry, patient surveying, disciplined labor, redundancy, and a willingness to correct the plan. The imperfect path is the strongest evidence of all. Real engineers do not abolish error. They anticipate it, detect it, and keep it from destroying the project. At Samos, two teams met within the mountain, not because the ancients possessed supernatural precision, but because they understood how to work when precision had limits. Sigiriya rises from the plains of Sri Lanka as a sheer mass of rock. Its summit towers about 200 meters above the surrounding landscape. The photograph makes it look like a natural fortress with ruins on top. But that view misses the essential point. Sigiriya was designed as an experience unfolding through movement. The complex is associated with King Kashyapa, who ruled in the late 5th century CE. Political conflict forms part of its history, but the site cannot be explained by defense alone. A fortress seeks to keep an enemy out. Sigiriya also choreographed the approach of invited visitors, officials, servants, and subjects. It transformed access into a demonstration of power. The performance began far from the summit. A visitor approached through a carefully organized landscape of moats, walls, gardens, pools, and paths. The central axis directed attention toward the rock. Water gardens introduced symmetry and control at ground level. Basins reflected the sky and the towering stone above them. In the rainy season, channels and fountains made water move through a landscape that appeared ordered by royal command. This was not decoration pasted onto a fortress. Hydraulic design was part of the political image. Reservoirs, underground conduits, differences in elevation and pressure allowed water to be collected and displayed. Some features still function when rainfall provides the necessary supply. The effect depended on maintenance, clean channels, intact surfaces, and workers who understood the network. As the route rose, the visitor's body became increasingly subject to the architecture. Broad gardens gave way to stairs and narrow passages. The rock filled more of the field of vision. Painted figures appeared on the face of the cliff. A polished wall reflected light and later accumulated inscriptions from visitors. The path did not offer an immediate view of the entire destination. It disclosed the complex in stages. At one point, the ascent passed between enormous lion paws. The upper structure that completed the lion has not survived, and reconstructions differ. What remains is enough to show that the entrance was not merely practical. The visitor crossed a symbolic threshold before climbing toward the summit. At the top, terraces, foundations, cisterns, and the remains of buildings occupy a limited and exposed area. The view is immense. From below, the ruler seems inaccessible. From above, the surrounding country appears contained in a single gaze. Height creates a military advantage, but it also creates hierarchy. The landscape is made to confirm the distance between ruler and subject. This is why the question, Palace, fortress, or monastery can be misleading if it demands one permanent answer. The site had different phases and functions. Defensive features are real. Courtly and ceremonial elements are real. Buddhist monastic use before and after Kashyapa's reign is also part of the archaeological picture. Ancient places change, and later use does not erase earlier meaning. Individual interpretations remain disputed. We cannot reconstruct every building on the summit or assign a certain ritual to every pool. Nor should a dramatic political narrative be allowed to explain every stone. Yet the broad spatial logic is unmistakable. Sigiriya combined natural topography, hydraulic engineering, gardens, painting, controlled access, and monumental ascent. It did not simply protect authority, it made authority visible, difficult to approach, and physically exhausting to reach. The visitor did not merely look at the monument organized the visitor. Where to walk, when to stop, what to see, and how small to feel. Ancient engineering, then, could manage more than matter and water. It could manage attention, emotion, and behavior. That psychological function will follow us to another city, where the most visible architecture belongs not to the living, but to the dead. In the sandstone landscape of northwestern Arabia, the Nabatean city of Hegra presents a striking paradox. Its most famous remains are monumental tomb facades. They are crisp, symmetrical, and dramatic, cut directly into isolated rock outcrops. The buildings in which people ate, traded, argued, and slept survive far less visibly. If we judge only by what photographs show best, Hegra seems like a city devoted almost entirely to death. That is an illusion created by preservation. Rock-cut tombs endure because much of their architecture is the cliff itself. Domestic buildings made with less durable materials suffer collapse, erosion, reuse, and centuries of rebuilding. The cemetery can therefore outlive the living city and come to represent it. Hegra contains more than 100 monumental tombs, most with decorated facades. Their design reveals cultural exchange. Architectural elements associated with Nabatean traditions appear beside forms familiar from the Hellenistic, Egyptian, and wider Near Eastern worlds. This does not make the monuments an incoherent collection of borrowed styles. It shows a society selecting and recombining visual languages along long-distance trade routes. The inscriptions are as important as the facades. They record names, family relationships, ownership, legal restrictions, and warnings against violation of a tomb. Epigraphy, the study of inscriptions, brings individual people back into an otherwise silent landscape. The texts show that a monumental tomb was not only a religious object, it was also property, governed by rights and obligations. Hegra flourished because it stood within networks connecting southern Arabia, the Red Sea, the Mediterranean, and inland markets. Caravans carried aromatics, textiles, metals, food, and information. Yet no trade route could sustain an urban settlement in an arid region without water. Wells and water management features are therefore central to the city's history. The Nabateans are rightly known for adapting to dry landscapes, but there is no need to turn that skill into legend. Their achievement lay in understanding local geology, locating groundwater, collecting runoff, protecting supplies, and maintaining access over time. This changes the image of Hegra. The carved facades announced status and preserved memory for the dead. The wells made life possible for everyone. One was spectacular, the other was indispensable. The contrast also exposes a general problem in archaeology and tourism. We tend to make the most photogenic remains stand for the entire settlement. At Hegra, that means allowing a cemetery to erase the city that built it. The correction is not to diminish the tombs, but to place them back within a living system of trade, water, property, labor, and cultural exchange. What survives most beautifully is not always what mattered most every day. Farther south, in what is now Sudan, the desert contains another landscape that popular history has placed at the edge of the map. Around Merowe rise clusters of steep-sided pyramids built for the rulers and elites of the Kingdom of Kush. The first reaction is usually numerical surprise. There are so many pyramids outside Egypt. But counting them is not enough. The more important task is to return Kush to history as a civilization in its own right. The pyramidal form did not belong eternally and exclusively to one people. Forms travel. They can be adopted, altered, and made to express a different political and religious world. The Meroitic pyramids are generally smaller and much steeper than the great Old Kingdom pyramids of Egypt. Their internal arrangement also differs. Burial chambers were commonly cut below ground, while a small offering chapel stood against the exterior. So, "it looks Egyptian" is not an explanation, and it certainly does not mean Egyptians built it. Kush had a long and complicated relationship with Egypt. Trade, warfare, diplomacy, occupation, imitation, and mutual influence all played a part. At times, Kushite rulers controlled Egypt itself. Later, the center of power shifted south toward Merowe and developed its own visual and political language. The necropolises formed part of a larger state. Merowe was connected with temples, settlements, agriculture, production, and long-distance exchange. Evidence of ironworking has attracted particular attention, although the scale and organization of the industry must be described carefully rather than through inflated claims. What is certain is that this was not an isolated field of tombs. It belonged to an urban and economic landscape. The Meroitic script offers both knowledge and frustration. Scholars can read many of its signs, but the language is not fully understood. Names and formulaic texts can often be recognized, while many details remain obscure. The result is an unequal historical record. The monuments are visible, yet the voices of the people who made them are only partly accessible. Modern damage has also shaped what we see. Tombs were robbed in antiquity and later periods. In the 19th century, treasure hunting and destructive excavation caused severe harm. The Italian adventurer Giuseppe Ferlini famously demolished the upper parts of pyramids while searching for valuables. Early archaeology did not always preserve the evidence it claimed to investigate. Erosion, instability, conflict, limited resources, and pressures from modern development continue to affect the sites. A monument may be ancient, but its survival is decided in the present. Merowe breaks a geographical illusion created by the standard story of civilization. When pyramids are treated as a synonym for Egypt, every other pyramid becomes a copy or curiosity. When Kush is restored to the center of its own history, the same structures become evidence of selection, transformation, and independent state power. Architecture can borrow a form without borrowing an identity. The people of Merowe did not simply repeat Egypt. They took part in a shared regional history and made a distinct language from it. The forgotten wonder here is therefore larger than any single pyramid. It is an entire civilization pushed into the shadow of a more familiar neighbor. By now, one pattern should be clear. None of these wonders existed because a ruler gave a single command and a monument somehow appeared. Construction was only the beginning. A structure had to be cleaned, repaired, supplied, guarded, illuminated, and administered day after day. This daily labor is easy to erase from the story because it is rarely monumental. A cleared drain does not look heroic. Replacing a worn stair, sealing a leaking reservoir, or carrying lamp oil into an underground chamber does not produce a grand facade. Yet without such work, the grand design fails. At Dolavira and Shushtar, sediment was a permanent enemy. Water carries earth, sand, plant material, and waste. When the current slows in a reservoir or channel, some of that material settles. Capacity shrinks, flow changes, and blockages appear. Channels and basins therefore required repeated cleaning. After floods, damaged masonry and embankments had to be inspected and restored. At Sigiriya, water gardens depended on more than ingenious hydraulic principles. Conduits had to remain open. Pools had to retain water. Plastered surfaces required repair. Steps and railings on exposed routes wore down under feet and weather. The political spectacle worked only because practical labor kept it working. Underground spaces created a different maintenance problem. At Hal Saflieni and in the tunnel of Upalinos, light and air mattered. Lamps needed fuel. Smoke and stale air limited the time people could work. Water could seep into passages. Loose stone had to be removed. Access routes had to be kept clear so that workers could inspect and repair sections invisible from the surface. Even Chankilo's apparent simplicity depended on care. Observation lines needed to remain usable, routes and platforms accessible, and knowledge transmitted from one observer to the next. An instrument is not only its physical parts, it also includes the trained practice required to read it. This distinction separates mobilization from operation. A state may gather thousands of workers for a building campaign, compel labor, organize specialists, and move enormous quantities of material. But keeping a system alive for decades or centuries requires another kind of organization: schedules, local knowledge, stored materials, administrators, and people responsible for unglamorous, repetitive tasks. We often credit a named king or architect because a single name is easier to remember. In reality, every wonder stood on layers of expertise. Surveyors set lines, quarry workers extracted stone, masons shaped it, carpenters built supports, water managers watched flow, scribes recorded obligations and supplies, seasonal laborers cleared silt, guards controlled access. Cooks and carriers sustained the workforce. Evidence for these people is uneven. Sometimes documents survive. More often, archaeology finds repair joints, replacement plaster, tool marks, worn thresholds, blocked channels, or later additions. These traces are not blemishes on a perfect original. They are the biography of the structure. Maintenance also explains why sophisticated systems can disappear quickly. A pyramid remains a pile of stone even when no one uses it. A hydraulic network loses its identity when water no longer moves through it. Within a short time, it may become physically fragmented and intellectually unreadable. A wonder did not cease to exist when the last wall fell. It ceased when the system of care ended. That leads to the final question. What exactly has to be lost before a wonder disappears from collective memory? The disappearance of a wonder rarely has one cause. It occurs when the structure deteriorates, the system that sustained it collapses, and the story explaining it is broken. The first mechanism is physical destruction. Earthquakes topple walls. Water undermines foundations. Vegetation enters joints and forces masonry apart. Wind drives sand against exposed surfaces. Salt crystallizes inside porous stone. Heat and cold expand and contract materials. None of these processes needs to destroy a site in one dramatic moment. Slow damage, accumulated across centuries, can be just as decisive. Different materials create different chances of survival. Rock-cut tombs at Hegra remain legible because the facade and cliff are one mass. Mud brick houses disappear far more easily. Timber roofs burn, decay, or are reused. Earthworks soften into the surrounding terrain. What survives is therefore not a neutral sample of what once existed. The second mechanism is deliberate reuse. An abandoned monument is a convenient quarry. Cut stone is expensive to produce and easy to carry away. Blocks migrate into houses, fortifications, roads, and later religious buildings. Metal clamps are extracted, bricks are taken. A community does not have to hate the past to dismantle it. It may simply need materials in the present. The third mechanism is the movement of roots and centers. Hegra mattered because people, goods, and information passed through its region. If trade shifts to another corridor, a prosperous city can become peripheral. Political capitals move, harbors silt up, roads change. A place once located at the center of a network may find itself beside a route no longer traveled. The fourth is the loss of function. D'Oliveira's reservoirs made sense as parts of an inhabited city. Schuster's hydraulic works required mills, fields, users, and administrators. Chanquilo's towers needed observers who understood the calendar. Once the social institution behind a structure disappears, the physical remains may persist while their meaning fades. The fifth mechanism is the break in textual tradition. A building becomes globally famous not only because it stands, but because people write about it, copy those descriptions, translate them, teach them, and connect them to a familiar story. The classical Seven Wonders benefited from such chains of repetition. Many monuments outside that literary world did not. Merowe shows how language can become a barrier even when inscriptions survive. The Meroitic script is partially readable, yet the language remains incompletely understood. The stones speak, but not loudly enough for every question we ask. When texts vanish entirely, later observers must reconstruct function from architecture, wear, deposits, and landscape alone. There is also a modern filter of fame. We do not encounter the past directly. Textbooks, museums, tourist routes, documentaries, political borders, and search algorithms stand between us and an ancient site. A monument near a major airport and a good road receives more visitors. It is photographed more often, restored more regularly, and inserted more easily into popular narratives. A site in a remote desert, an unstable region, or a country with limited tourism infrastructure remains less visible, even when its historical value is comparable. The history of archaeology matters too. European scholarship devoted disproportionate attention to Greece, Rome, and Egypt for generations. Objects from those regions filled major museums, influenced art, and became fixed in education. Through that lens, Merowe could be reduced to a southern extension of Egypt, rather than recognized as the center of an independent state. Visual appeal has its own power. Sigiriya makes an immediate photograph. A solitary rock creates a compelling image without explanation. A hydraulic network is harder to show. Several channels, a difference in elevation, and the direction of flow require narration. The spectacular facade becomes famous faster than the complex mechanism. Oblivion is therefore assembled from multiple losses. Material decays. Maintenance stops. Economic roots move away. Function disappears. The language of description is broken. Modern culture then selects from what remains the objects easiest to display and easiest to fit into a familiar story. There is no need to invent a conspiracy. No one has to hide an ancient wonder deliberately. Several ordinary historical processes acting together are enough to remove it from mass memory. Even the word forgotten must be used with care. Many monuments never disappeared from the memory of local communities. People knew them, visited them, incorporated them into stories, and reused them. They became forgotten mainly to a global culture that later presented its own selection of antiquities as the universal history of humankind. The individual sites now form one system. A wonder emerges through knowledge, resources, and organization. It exists while people maintain it. It loses significance when its function disappears. It decays when repair stops. and it falls out of history when no one can explain what it was. Yet one final danger remains. In restoring importance to neglected structures, it is easy to cross a line and attribute to ancient builders things the evidence cannot support. We must now separate reconstructed history from a persuasive hypothesis, and a persuasive hypothesis from an attractive fantasy. After such a journey, the temptation is to make the ancient world even more mysterious than it was. We see a tunnel inside a mountain, an underground temple, or an urban water system, and immediately begin talking about lost knowledge supposedly superior to our own. It sounds dramatic, but it shows less respect for ancient builders than it appears to. Archaeology works with several levels of confidence. First, there are things that can be measured: the length and changing course of the tunnel of Eupalinos, the positions of Chankilo's towers, the depth of the chambers at Hal Saflieni, the direction of Dolavira's channels. These are the hard foundations. Then there are conclusions supported by several kinds of evidence. Chankilo's relationship to the sun's annual movement is not based on an attractive idea alone. It is supported by the alignment of observation points, the sequence of towers, and calculations of the solar arc. Beyond that lies probable reconstruction. We may reasonably suggest that the unusual acoustics of Hal Saflieni were noticed and perhaps used in ceremonies. We cannot reconstruct a specific ritual with the same confidence. Finally, there are proposals for which evidence is presently insufficient. They may be discussed, but they must not be presented as established history. Visual reconstructions require particular caution. An artist can show Sigiriya completed, fill its gardens with water, and place people on its stairways. Such an image helps us imagine space, but every restored roof, item of clothing, and ceremonial gesture contains a measure of assumption. A convincing picture does not become evidence merely by looking real. The reverse principle matters as well. If archaeologists have not found a particular surveying instrument, that does not mean the tunnel of Eupalinos required an unknown technology. Wood, cord, and other materials preserve poorly. An engineering method can also be reconstructed from the marks left by work, even when the tools themselves have disappeared. Sometimes the correct answer is simply, "We do not yet know." That is not a weakness of science. It is the boundary separating investigation from invention. Ancient people need not be portrayed either as helpless primitives or as owners of supernatural knowledge. They observed, measured, made mistakes, corrected calculations, organized labor, and passed on professional experience. That is precisely why their achievements are genuinely impressive. Forgotten structures astonish us, not because they contradict history, but because the popular version of history showed us only a small part of the ancient world for far too long. Thank you for staying with me to the end. I hope you enjoyed the journey. Until next time, and good night.